Have you ever wondered how Indonesia, a nation with a rich cultural tapestry, came under the control of foreign powers? Let's take a moment to consider this. Indonesia's colonial history is a complex interplay of power dynamics, with several colonial rulers leaving their mark on this vibrant archipelago. From the early arrivals to the Dutch era, the British interlude, and the Japanese occupation, each chapter contributed to the nation's evolving identity. Join us as we delve into the intriguing colonial past of Indonesia. Our journey begins in the 16th century with the arrival of the Portuguese. A time when the lure of exotic spices and untapped resources drew explorers from all corners of the globe. And so the Portuguese, the first European power to set foot on Indonesia, made their mark on this archipelago's rich tapestry of history. The Portuguese were not just explorers, but also traders and missionaries. They were enticed by the allure of the Spice Islands, now known as the Maluku Islands. It was here that cloves, nutmeg and mace, precious commodities of the time, grew in abundance. The Portuguese quickly established control over the spice trade, bringing these coveted goods back to Europe and reaping immense profits. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Portuguese found themselves entangled in conflicts with local kingdoms. The indigenous rulers, unaccustomed to foreign interference, resisted the Portuguese attempts to exert control. This led to numerous skirmishes and battles as the Portuguese fought to maintain their foothold in this lucrative region. An interesting event to note during this period was the Bandanese War. The Portuguese, in their pursuit of monopoly over the spice trade, faced fierce resistance from the local Bandanese people. This conflict highlighted the complex dynamics between the colonizers and the colonized, a theme that would recur throughout Indonesia's colonial history. Despite their initial successes, the Portuguese rule in Indonesia was marked by instability. Their attempts to monopolize the spice trade, combined with their military and religious interventions, stirred resentment among the local populace. This discontent, along with the growing competition from other European powers, led to the eventual decline of the Portuguese influence in Indonesia. The Portuguese rule, however, was short-lived, as another European power was waiting in the wings. This marked the end of the first chapter of Indonesia's colonial history, but as we'll see, it was far from the end of the story. The stage was set for the arrival of a new player, one that would leave an even more indelible mark on the history of this diverse archipelago. As the 17th century dawned, the Dutch VOC began its foray into Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company, or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, VOC in Dutch, was a trading giant that held a virtual monopoly over the spice trade in the Indonesian archipelago, a monopoly that would become the cornerstone of their economic empire. The VOC's stranglehold on the spice trade was a masterclass in monopolistic trade practices. They controlled not only the supply of spices, but also dictated their prices in international markets. This was achieved through a combination of shrewd business tactics, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, brute force. The VOC's primary interest in Indonesia was its wealth of natural resources, particularly its spices. Nutmeg, cloves, and mace were worth their weight in gold in the markets of Europe, and the VOC was intent on controlling this lucrative trade. The company established a network of trading posts throughout the archipelago and imposed strict controls on the production and trade of these precious commodities. The Dutch were not content with merely controlling the trade. They also sought to exploit the island's resources to the fullest. They introduced new crops, such as coffee and sugar, and forced the local population to cultivate them under a system known as cultuurstelsel, or cultivation system. This system, however, was exploitative, leading to widespread hardship among the indigenous population. The impact of the VOC's policies on the indigenous population was profound. On the one hand, Dutch rule brought about a degree of stability and order that had been lacking under the fragmented rule of local sultans. On the other hand, the VOC's monopolistic practices and the cultivation system led to widespread exploitation and hardship. It's a period marked by the struggle of the indigenous population against the economic and social transformations imposed by the Dutch. As the VOC's fortunes began to decline in the late 18th century due to mismanagement and corruption, it was dissolved, and its possessions were taken over by the Dutch government. This marked the beginning of the Dutch colonial government, which was to rule Indonesia for the next century and a half. The transition from VOC to Dutch government control was not smooth. The Dutch government sought to impose a more structured and bureaucratic system of rule, which met with resistance from the local population. Yet despite the challenges, the Dutch government managed to consolidate its control over the archipelago, creating a colonial state that was to last until the mid-20th century. The Dutch control over Indonesia was to last for more than 3 centuries, but it was not without its challenges. The legacy of this period is complex and continues to shape Indonesia's economic, social, and political landscape. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's remember the Dutch era as a time of great change, a time when a distant European power left its indelible mark on the history of this fascinating archipelago. In the early 19th century, a new colonial power made its presence felt in Indonesia, the British. This period, often seen as an interlude in the grander narrative of Dutch colonialism, was nonetheless a significant chapter in Indonesia's historical tapestry. During the Napoleonic Wars, as European powers grappled for control, Britain found an opportunity to extend its influence in the Southeast Asian archipelago. In the early 1800s, specifically between 1811 and 1816, British rule was established under the leadership of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. Raffles, known for his progressive policies, brought about key changes in the administration and land taxation system. He abolished the Dutch slave trade, introduced partial self-governance, and even took steps to preserve the local culture, which included commissioning the first comprehensive study of the island of Java. However, this British interlude was short-lived. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 led to a significant reshuffling of colonial territories. As part of the agreement, the British returned control of Indonesia to the Dutch in 1816, marking the end of their brief but impactful rule. While the British period was indeed fleeting, it left an indelible mark on the social, cultural, and political landscape of Indonesia. The changes introduced during this time provided the groundwork for future reforms, setting the stage for Indonesia's long journey towards independence. The British rule was a brief interlude in the long Dutch reign. The 20th century brought with it a new power, Japan. As World War II raged on, Japan seized the opportunity to expand its empire. In early 1942, the Japanese forces invaded Indonesia, effectively ending 3.5 centuries of Dutch rule. The Dutch were unprepared for such a swift and powerful attack and surrendered within a matter of months. Thus began the era of the Japanese occupation. Japan's initial promise of Asia for Asians sparked a ray of hope among the Indonesian population. They dreamt of liberation from foreign rule, but the reality was far from it. The Japanese reign was one of strict military rule and harsh policies. Resources were extracted for the war effort, food was scarce, and forced labor became the norm. The Indonesian population bore the brunt of these hardships, with millions falling victim to famine and forced labor. But amidst the hardship, a spark was ignited. The Japanese, recognizing the strategic advantage of a supportive local population, began promoting Indonesian nationalism. They allowed the use of the Indonesian language in place of Dutch, and even encouraged the formation of volunteer army units. For the first time, Indonesians were given a taste of what it could be like to govern themselves. This newfound sense of nationalism did not dissipate with the end of the war. Instead, it fanned the flames of a desire for independence. Many of the leaders of the eventual independence movement were those who had been involved in the volunteer army units. They were the ones who carried the torch of nationalism, and they were ready to fight for an independent Indonesia. The end of World War II in 1945 saw the Japanese forces withdraw from Indonesia, but the seeds of nationalism they had sown remained. The Indonesian people, having tasted the possibility of self-governance, were not willing to return to being a colony. The end of World War II marked the end of foreign rule in Indonesia. So what can we take away from Indonesia's colonial history? In a nutshell, the country's past is a rich tapestry woven through centuries of foreign influence. From the early arrivals to the Dutch era, the British interlude, and the Japanese occupation, each phase left indelible marks on Indonesia's culture, economy, and national identity. The colonial powers introduced new technologies, economic systems, and cultural practices that continue to shape Indonesia even today. However, this external influence was not without its challenges. The struggle against colonial rule ignited a strong sense of nationalism that led to the birth of an independent Indonesia. Moreover, the resilience and spirit of the Indonesian people shone through in their resistance against colonial rule. This resistance, whether through armed struggle or peaceful protest, has become a cornerstone of the Indonesian identity. Indonesia's colonial past is a testament to its resilience and its enduring spirit. It's a story of survival, resistance, and ultimately independence.